really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate you listening in to this podcast from time to time, however often you listen. And I'd like to ask you to do me a favor. If you enjoy this content, please tell other people about the podcast or share it with them. That will help me grow my audience. And also subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you happen to be listening. And then if you feel inclined, leave a rating and a review for the podcast, because that will also help me increase the number of people who are listening in for this kind of information. And finally, if you want to offer more support to the podcast, you can go to my page at Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU. You can make a small monthly contribution there that will help keep this podcast and End of Life University podcast on the air. So thank you for listening to my little promotion there. And I'll move on to the content of today's episode. If you've been listening in for the last few months, you know that I've been talking about some of the most frequently Googled questions about life. I got this list from a Google site. And so these have been the questions that people type in to Google when they're searching for answers about life. And I've been really fascinating to see what people are asking about. And the question I'd like to address today is, how can I be a better person? To be honest, I was really thrilled when I saw that question on the list, because I believe it's really important that each one of us should actually desire to be a better person than we already are. We need to accept ourselves as we are and appreciate who we are. But I think within us, there always is some sort of a drive somewhere to do better, or to grow, or to learn things, or to become a better version of ourselves. So it made me happy to see that people are typing that in and actually wondering, what does it take to be a better person? So I want to take this on and talk to you a little bit about how I see it, or what I think it takes to work towards being a better person. And I'm using a little nomenclature that came from Ken Wilber, the founder of Integral Theory. And I've quoted from Ken before and talked about his work. His work is way too complex for me to get into very much in this podcast, though I will keep referring to it. But Ken has this really simple little 4-part system, I think, for becoming a better person. And I won't be describing these exactly how Ken does. I have my own take on these 4 things, but I am using his nomenclature. So I'll list them for you first, and then we'll go back and talk about each one of these 4 things. So the first one is wake up, then grow up, then clean up, and finally show up. I love that because it's easy to remember. It's catchy. So something that we can even have in our minds, wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. Those are 4 simple things we can focus on. Simple, but not necessarily easy. So let's go through them one at a time. The first one is to wake up. And what I feel, the reason I'm excited that people are actually Googling how to be a better person is because the moment you ask that question, you are already awake. You have already awakened to the idea that there is something bigger or better about you that you could activate in your own life. And the way I interpret this, and if you've read my book, The Journey from Ego to Soul, you can read all about this. is that most of us begin life operating primarily through our egos. It's the ego that interprets the world, the ego that motivates us, that tells us how to operate and behave in the world. But the ego is entirely self-focused. And the ego also has a lot of misperceptions about itself. And so someone living purely from the ego with no other awareness outside of the ego will most likely believe that they are already perfect. They're already fine. They are already being the best person they can be, and they're right about all the things that they think and believe. They have no reason to question themselves, and the ego's really comfortable in that particular place with that particular view of the world. Like, the way I see the world is the right way, and I have no reason to question that, and anyone who disagrees with me is wrong. And that's the ego's perspective on life. So to be able to ask the question, how can I be better, means that the ego has awakened a little bit to this idea that there is something more than who I am. There's something more than how I see myself in this moment, and I could be working toward something bigger than me. And as I mentioned in my book, The Journey from Ego to Soul, I believe that it's our higher self, higher consciousness, our divine self, if you want to say that, the soul, that is constantly present within us, that is the inspiration for wanting to do better and be better in the world. And there is this moment of awakening for the ego when the ego recognizes it's not just me. There's something more. There's something more to this life. There's something more that could be happening here. That's a really powerful moment, because you cannot grow until you have an awakening of the ego that allows you to see something greater or bigger that you could be, and then opens the door for you to begin to work toward this growth and learning. So in the book, I write about there are lots of different experiences that help the ego wake up, and sometimes they're traumatic experiences. Sometimes we go through a loss and we're in the midst of grief, and we suddenly begin to see that this isn't just about my ego. There is something more there. The ego can't cope with the situation it's in and begins to recognize there's something else here, and I need to find out what that is. I need to go beyond what I view of life and how I see things. So oftentimes it is a traumatic or difficult experience that helps us wake up, but not always. Many people have these transformative experiences that open their eyes somehow, and they become aware of something beyond themselves, and that begins their process of waking up. So what I'm saying here is, if you are asking that question, how can I be a better person? You're already waking up. You're already at step one, which is really good. I've often wondered, can we help someone else wake up who isn't awake? I think possibly. I think education is one way of doing that. I think also, if you are an awakened person, you're living from your higher consciousness, you operate as your best self in the world, you can become an inspiration for other people who, when they see you and how you are living your life, may be able to get a reflection back of themselves and say, I don't have what that person has. I wish I did. I would like that. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be something traumatic and that another person experiences, but you yourself, by simply being your highest and best self, might be a motivator or an inspiration to help someone else wake up. So I don't know that we can decide, I want that person to wake up, I'm going to wake them up. I don't know that we can intentionally go to another person and say, you need to wake up now and help them wake up. Maybe so, that may be possible. But I think oftentimes we inspire other people around us without even realizing that we're doing it. And there's something really pure and beautiful about that, that we don't need to get our own minds involved necessarily in trying to manipulate someone else or control their reaction. We simply just have to be ourselves, be who we are. And that's how we may have the best and highest impact on another person. So the way I look at waking up, I believe that we are always on a trajectory of growth. It's always possible for us to grow more and learn more. But the ego tends to slow that process down. It puts up obstructions and blocks towards growth. It can even corrupt the process and take us backwards at times. If we aren't awake to the ego and recognizing how the ego operates within us, and if we don't know that we have a higher self. So waking up requires us to really look at how do I look at myself? How do I see myself? Am I aware of the fact that I have an ego that's operative, but I also have a higher self that's operative? And I can shift the balance. Which part of me dictates how I operate in the world? And which part of me do I give power and control to in my life? And again, that's what my book, The Journey from Ego to Soul, is about. How do we switch from being ego-driven to be soul-guided or directed in our lives? So part of waking up is really being able to look at ourselves honestly and see what part of me does control my life, what part of me determines how I behave and how I show up in the world. So I want to emphasize here also that the ego is not bad. The ego is important. We each need a healthy ego in order to operate in the world. So this is not about rejecting or vilifying the ego or killing the ego, as I've seen written in some spiritual books. It's simply about recognizing the ego, valuing our own ego, seeing its limitations, and choosing to see beyond what the ego offers us. So we really have to learn, how do we hold both perspectives? How do we hold our ego and even be grateful for the ego we have, because it allows us to move through the world and operate in our day-to-day lives, but not allow the ego to take over the power and the control of how we behave in life. So we view the ego, we appreciate it, we're grateful that we have an ego, but we keep it within certain boundaries of how the ego operates, and we use our higher self and higher awareness to help us evaluate the ego and to help us keep the ego in check. So let's move on to step number 2, which is to grow up. And once we wake up, that's when we may become aware of the fact that I'm not very mature necessarily in how I operate. This is when we start to encounter our emotions. We see, how do our emotions take over at times and control how we behave in the world? And growing up is really learning about ourselves and how we operate in our day-to-day lives, especially around other people in various situations. So we need to first look at our own emotions, be honest with ourselves about those emotions, and learn, how do I manage my emotions? Again, we don't want to get rid of our emotions. We don't want to get rid of anger, sadness, fear, whatever emotions we're dealing with here. We want to understand them. We want to learn what triggers them. Where do I lose control over those emotions? And how do I appreciate the fact that our emotions also, like our ego, are positive? They benefit us in many ways, but we need to learn how to manage them. So growing up, in my opinion, is where we figure out what does it take to experience all of my emotions, allow all of them to be there, allow my anger, allow my sadness, allow my fear, and allow my positive emotions as well to be there, but to have a higher sense of managing those emotions, of choosing how I behave when those emotions are present. So again, it's the higher self that comes in that helps us manage the emotions. So first we recognize our ego, then we begin to recognize the emotions that we carry within us and how we operate when we're experiencing different emotions. So it requires a lot of emotional intelligence that we've talked about to understand ourselves so deeply. We know what our emotions are. We know what our triggers are. We know what we need to get a better handle on in terms of how we behave in the world. So ultimately, as we begin to grow up, we're going to focus on how we view other people, how we respond to other people, and how we treat other people. So we want to expand our perspective way beyond our own ego, our own emotions, ourselves, to incorporate others and to begin to see things from the perspective of other people, to recognize like life looks different to that person than it does to me. They're dealing with an entirely different ego and entirely different emotional triggers than I am. When we can begin to take this perspective of other people, we start to grow our capacity to feel love for others and also to forgive others. And so those are two key components of growing up. When we are able to go beyond ourselves and our self-concerns and feel compassion, feel love for someone else, and extend to them our grace, our gratitude, our forgiveness. That's all part of growing up in the world. Next, we're going to focus on cleaning up, which in some ways is probably the task we like the least of these four things, having to clean up our own shadow issues. And I liken it in a way to doing some of the maintenance work that's necessary, say, on our homes, things that we really hate doing, like cleaning the filters in the furnace, like cleaning out the gutters on the house, or testing out the plumbing to make sure it still works. Some of those underlying maintenance issues that we're not always thinking about, we're not conscious of every day. We have to intentionally decide, I need to do these tasks and this work every now and then because it keeps everything functioning better and it keeps things from corroding and corrupting underneath the surface. So we're not always aware of what needs to be cleaned up in our lives. We have to create an intentional practice that reminds us, I want to look at my shadow, I want to go deep within, and I want to clear things up. Because sometimes when we're trying to wake up and grow up, what interferes with those two tasks are the wounds that we carry within our shadow. Wounds from childhood, wounds from adolescence, wounds from various traumas we've experienced in life that have ended up being stored deep inside of us. So when we're having trouble growing up and dealing with our emotions, it might be that there are hidden wounds like down in the basement that we need to go down there and pay attention to and work on. We need to clean those up. So again, as I said, it requires us to have an intentional practice where we're willing to sit down and look deep within. Like, what is it that has caused me pain in the past, and where might I have shut myself down in a way in order to protect myself from that pain? We have to intentionally go back and experience the pain so that we can heal it, so that we can resolve it, and we can keep it from being a landmine, more or less, that can explode every now and then, and help turn it into an asset, a learning experience, something that has shaped us or changed us in a certain way. that maybe at some point we will begin to appreciate or feel gratitude for. So again, this work, cleaning up, does not always appeal to us, but we have to recognize how important and valuable it really is. And one of the challenging tasks of cleaning up that we need to remember is the ability to be honest with ourselves and with other people. Carolyn Mace, who's a spiritual teacher that I've been following for years, she says, keep a journal every day of your lies, the lies that you tell to yourself and others. And that shocked me a little bit. And I thought, no way, I don't want to write about that. But what she says is that until we start to recognize that it's very easy for us to not be honest, we don't learn how to be honest. We don't learn how to tell the truth even in difficult situations. So becoming totally honest with yourself and with others, at least making that a goal and something that you work on, is part of this act of cleaning up. So we'll talk a little bit more about how you might do that. So the fourth task is to show up. And I always think of showing up as just, how do you behave in the world? How do you treat yourself? How do you treat other people in your day-to-day life? When you leave your house and go out in public and are around others, how do you show up in the world? And so again, showing up can change as soon as we wake up and begin to grow up and start doing our cleaning up work. The way we show up in the world will change automatically. And it's amazing. And suddenly, when you've been working on these things, you may find yourself coming across in a completely different way with strangers than you may have in the past. And you're not doing it from your head. It's happening automatically from who you are, from deep within you, that the way you talk to people, the energy that you have when you're around others will change and transform. And so you will show up differently when you have been doing this work on yourself. And that's an amazing thing. But it's also helpful if you look at how you do show up in the world. And if you allow yourself to look in the mirror a little bit and think about, how do I treat people? How do I operate when something doesn't go the way I want it to? When the line at the store is too long, or when someone in front of me is taking forever, or when someone steals my parking place, or when I'm just irritated that pedestrians are crossing the street and I have to stop to wait for them. I'm using a lot of metaphors involving driving and traveling around from place to place, but oftentimes that's when our lesser selves show up, when we're interacting in a situation where things are not going the way we would like it to. So it's really helpful while you're going through this process and working on your growth to be able to analyze each day, how am I showing up in the world? What do I bring to the world? What do I give to other people? And you can make choices about how you show up and actively work on those behaviors, like choosing to do an act of kindness intentionally. You could give yourself that assignment that every week I'm going to think of one kind thing that I could do, and I'm going to carry that out. Because once you start to operate from kindness and operate from your better self, your higher self, you start to get used to that pathway, and you'll get more and more inspiration and more ideas of, how do I let my better self lead when I'm in difficult situations? So I'll go back and review those 4 things. Again, this nomenclature is from Ken Wilber, and I'm giving you my spin on these 4 things. Wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up. I love it. You can remember those 4 things. You can keep that in your head because it rhymes, for one thing. But every day you can ask yourself those questions. Am I waking up? Am I continuing to wake up every day and to see more within myself than I used to see there's a bigger and higher view of my life? Am I growing up? Am I learning how to manage my emotions and my ego so that I'm not just operating from my lowest possible self? Am I doing some of the cleaning up work also? Am I healing some of my old trauma and wounds? And am I changing how I show up in the world? So I want to offer some thoughts about how do we make some of these changes. And one thing I thought of is to first focus on deciding to take better care of yourself. First of all, your physical health. Do you need to get a little more exercise? Could you improve your diet a little bit? Could you get more sleep at night? Think about how do you take care of just this physical body that you have that carries you around through the world. Think about how do you care for yourself emotionally and mentally. And maybe look at what do you feed yourself mentally? What do you read? What programs do you watch on television? What do you listen to? Could you improve those a little bit? Could you change a little bit of what do you put in to your mind? And if you're taking in a lot of negative news or social media that causes you a lot of distress, that might be something you need to change a little bit. Not get rid of it totally, but maybe you need less of that and you need to counterbalance it with something that helps you feel more positive about life, that helps you feel more love and more gratitude and more generosity in life. So maybe you need to get a better balance in terms of what you are feeding yourself mentally. And I'll say again, I say this all the time, but I think journaling is really important, particularly when you're trying to grow up and manage your emotions and you're trying to clean up your shadow and you're working on being honest. It's really important to have a place where you reflect as often as possible, daily if you can, or at least a couple of times a week. You reflect on what is happening inside of you. How are you growing? How are you changing? And also reflect on the times when your behavior doesn't match up to what you were hoping for. And be willing to be honest with yourself. Analyze like what happened when I had that phone call with my sister and I completely lost it. How did that happen? What was going on inside of me? What was I thinking? What was I feeling? And how did I end up saying things that I wish I hadn't said? You need to be able to analyze all of these uncomfortable or negative situations that happen day to day. And your journal is the perfect place to do it, to write about it, to ask yourself questions, to think about what happened during that process, and also brainstorm for yourself, how might I make that better in the future if I'm in another situation like that? How can I get better control over my emotions? And how can I choose better ways of communicating with someone when I need to say something that's difficult or challenging? So these are all things you can process in your journal. You're communicating with yourself, really having a dialogue in some ways, reflecting on yourself. And it's one of the best possible ways, I believe, that you can grow. You could do Carolyn Mace's practice of at the end of every day, write down, did I tell any lies today? And why did I do that? Where did that come from? And that's a great way to start to recognize the times that, every one of us is dishonest, probably way more than we realize in our lives. And once you start looking at it, you'll begin to notice like, oh gosh, whenever I'm with that person, I tend to exaggerate things that I'm talking about when I'm telling them stories. And understand, well, why? Why would I do that? Why would I exaggerate? Maybe because I have a need to impress them. Maybe my self-esteem isn't good enough and I feel like I have to embellish stories in order to make me look better than I think I am. It's a great way to just uncover what are those wounds inside, what do we need to work on and improve. So I can't say it enough. One of the best ways to be a better person, keep a journal, use it to work on this process of constantly growing and learning, of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and showing up. So this is obviously a huge discussion that we could have, and we could probably talk for an entire year just on this topic alone. So what I've given you today is just a really small nugget of some of the ways to look at how to be a better person. These are all things I use in my life and practices and what things I work on every day. So I'm not claiming to be any kind of expert. I'm only sharing with you what has been helpful for me in hopes that it will be helpful for you as well, and that you'll find yourself on this trajectory too of growing a little bit every day toward being a better person. So until next week, remember that we're here for love. So when all else fails, focus on love as much as possible. Face your fear. Be ready for whatever life throws at you next, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.